The body lies somewhere beneath these mountains. That much is known. Where exactly, no one can say. It has been 800 years since Genghis Khan died, and in all that time, no one has found his tomb. His funeral escort killed every witness they encountered on the road back from the battlefield. Then, according to legend, the escort itself was slaughtered to preserve the secret. A forest was planted over the burial site. Rivers were diverted. The earth was trampled by 10,000 horses until no trace remained. And so the man who conquered more of the world than anyone before or since vanished into the ground without a marker, his resting place one of history's most jealously guarded mysteries. But the empire he built did not vanish. It stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the tropical coasts of Vietnam. 24 million square kilometers, 16% of the Earth's land surface. At its height, 1 in 4 human beings alive answered to Mongol authority. No empire in history covered more ground. Rome took 400 years to build its domain. The Mongols surpassed it in 25. How did nomadic herders on the edge of the known world accomplish what the most sophisticated civilizations could not? And what did it cost them? Before we dive into that story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything to me, and I am genuinely curious, where in the world are you joining me from today? Drop a comment and let me know. The answer begins in a place most maps did not bother to label. The Mongolian steppe in the 12th century was not a nation. It was a killing ground. Dozens of tribes grazed their herds across the grasslands, each one a sovereign entity unto itself, each one at war with the others. The Mongols, the Tatars, the Merkits, the Naimans, the Karites. They raided each other's camps, stole each other's livestock, kidnapped each other's women, murdered each other's chieftains. Allegiances shifted like wind patterns. A blood brother today could be tomorrow's executioner. Survival required not just strength but cunning, flexibility, the capacity to read which way power was moving before it moved. Children grew up learning that loyalty was conditional and that weakness was fatal. The steppe did not tolerate sentimentality. It selected for ruthlessness. The landscape itself enforced this brutal calculus. The steppe was a vast ocean of grass, stretching endlessly in every direction, broken only by occasional rivers and mountain ranges. In summer, the sun beat down mercilessly, and water sources became precious commodities worth fighting over. In winter, temperatures plunged to depths that could kill an unprepared traveler in hours. The wind never stopped. It howled across the grasslands, carrying dust in summer and snow in winter, a constant reminder that nature here recognized no master. The tribes that survived in this environment were those that had learned to move with the seasons, following the grass as it greened and withered. They lived in felt tents called gers, structures that could be dismantled and loaded onto carts in a matter of hours. Everything they owned had to be portable. Wealth was measured not in land which could not be held, but in horses and livestock. A man's status was determined by the size of his herds and the number of warriors he could field. This was a world where children learned to ride before they learned to walk steadily. Boys were placed on horseback at 3 or 4 years old, taught to grip with their legs while their hands remained free for the bow. Archery training began almost as early. Small boys practiced on rabbits and ground squirrels, graduating to larger game as their strength increased. By adolescence, a steppe warrior could shoot accurately from a galloping horse, loosing arrows in rapid succession, hitting targets behind him using the famous Parthian shot. These were not skills learned in formal training grounds. They were survival skills, passed from father to son, practiced daily, refined over lifetimes. Girls, too, were trained in riding and sometimes in archery. Women on the steppe had more autonomy than their counterparts in sedentary civilizations. They managed the camps when men were away raiding or hunting. They made crucial economic decisions about when to move, where to graze, which animals to slaughter, and which to preserve for breeding. Some women fought alongside men. The chronicles mention female warriors among the Mongols, though their numbers were small. But whether they fought or not, women were expected to be tough, resilient, capable of enduring the same hardships as men. Around the year 1162, a child was born into this world. His father, Yesugei, was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a man of some local standing but no great wealth or influence. His mother, Holan, had been kidnapped from another tribe, the Merkits, a common practice. The boy was named Temüjin, after a Tatar chieftain his father had recently defeated in battle. The name was a trophy. It signified victory, but it also marked the family for retaliation. The Tatars would remember. According to legend, Temüjin was born clutching a blood clot in his fist, a sign that he was destined to be a great warrior. The story may be apocryphal, added later to justify his rise, but the Mongols believed in omens and portents. They saw the will of heaven in natural phenomena, in the flights of birds, in the patterns of weather. A child born with a blood clot would have been noted, marked as special. Temujin's childhood was ordinary by steppe standards, but that ordinariness was itself extraordinary by the measures of settled civilizations. He learned to ride almost before he could walk. He learned to shoot a bow from horseback, to track animals, to endure cold and hunger without complaint. The steppe taught economy of motion. There was no room for waste, no margin for error. Resources were scarce. Survival meant extracting maximum value from minimum input. A horse, a bow, a felt tent. That was all a family needed to live and all they could afford to carry. Mobility was everything. The tribes followed the grass, moving their camps with the seasons, always searching for better pasture, always prepared to flee or fight. But beyond these practical skills, Temüjin was learning something more fundamental. He was learning to read people. The steppe demanded social intelligence as much as physical prowess. A chieftain's son had to understand the delicate web of relationships that held a tribe together. He had to know which families were loyal and which were wavering. He had to sense when an alliance was strengthening and when it was about to fracture. He had to learn the art of persuasion, of offering rewards and making threats, of building coalitions from the shifting sands of tribal politics. Yesugei was teaching his son these lessons, sometimes explicitly, sometimes through example. Temüjin watched his father negotiate with other chieftains, saw how he balanced generosity with firmness, how he rewarded loyalty and punished betrayal. He learned that leadership on the steppe was not a matter of giving orders, it was a matter of building consensus, of convincing men that their interests aligned with yours, of creating bonds strong enough to hold when tested by hardship and danger. When Temüjin was 9 years old, his father took him to the Ongirat tribe to arrange a marriage. This was standard practice. Alliances between tribes were sealed with betrothals. Political and economic considerations determined marriages far more than personal preference. A marriage was a treaty, a merger of resources and obligations. Temüjin was introduced to a girl named Berta, and the families agreed to terms. Berta was slightly older than Temüjin, intelligent and strong-willed, from a family of some standing. The match was advantageous for both sides. Yesugei left his son with the Ongirats to serve Berta's father, as was customary. The boy would live with his future in-laws for a period, proving his worth through work and demonstrating his character. It was a test and a bonding period. Then Yesugei began the journey home. On the way, he stopped to share a meal with a group of Tatars. They recognized him. They remembered the insults he had inflicted, the raids he had led, the relatives they had lost to his warriors. They poisoned him. The poison worked slowly, giving him time to realize what had been done, but not time enough to seek help or revenge. By the time Yasuge reached his own camp, he was dying. He sent for Temüjin, but it was too late. The boy was days away. Yasuge died before his son returned, probably in agony, his organs failing, his body racked with convulsions. What happened next would define everything that followed. With Yasuge dead, the Borjigin clan faced a question. Leadership of the clan traditionally passed to the eldest son, but Temüjin was a child, living with another tribe. The clan could wait for him to grow up, or they could choose a new leader and move on. They moved on. When Temüjin returned, he found his family abandoned. The Taichud clan, which had been part of Yasuge's confederation, declared they would no longer follow a widow and her children. They packed their tents and left. Other families followed. Within days, Temüjin's mother, Hoelun, stood alone on the steppe with her children and no one else. This was not unusual. Steppe society operated on the principle of strength. A family that could not defend itself had no claim to loyalty. Widows and orphans were liabilities. Abandoning them was rational. But Hoelun did not accept abandonment. She grabbed the tribal banner, the white horsetail standard that symbolized leadership, and rode after the departing clans, shouting at them to return. It was a desperate, almost futile gesture. A woman alone, with small children, trying to command men who had already decided to leave. But her fury and determination made an impression. A few families stayed, not many. Enough to avoid complete destitution, but not enough to maintain the family's status. Temüjin, his mother, his 3 full brothers, his sister, and 2 half-brothers now lived on the margins of tribal society. They survived by fishing, hunting small game, digging for wild roots. This was humiliating work for people who had been nobility. Warriors hunted on horseback, pursuing deer and antelope across the open steppe. Fishing was what poor people did, those who could not afford horses or did not have the skill to hunt properly. Digging for roots was the work of the desperate, but Hoelun taught her children that survival mattered more than pride. She kept them alive through sheer force of will. She taught them to work together, to share equally, to endure hardship without complaint. The experience branded itself into Temüjin's mind. He learned that the structures people claimed were permanent could dissolve overnight. He learned that birth status meant nothing without power to back it up. He learned that the world did not care about your suffering. It only cared whether you could endure. These were hard lessons, the kind that shape a soul permanently. Many boys would have broken under such circumstances, would have given in to despair, or died from the sheer grinding misery of poverty and social exclusion. But Temüjin did not break. He hardened. The years of poverty ground on. Temüjin and his brothers grew older and stronger. They became more effective hunters, bringing back larger game, contributing more to the family's survival. But strength brought new problems. There was not enough food for everyone. Temüjin and his full brother Kasar hunted together and brought back game, but their half-brothers Beta and Belgute, born to a different mother, took the best portions. In a household with enough to eat, this would have been a minor irritation. In a household living at subsistence level, it was intolerable. Tensions simmered. Beta was older and stronger than Temüjin. He asserted dominance through physical intimidation, taking what he wanted, dismissing the protests of his younger half-brothers. One day, Beta stole a fish and a bird that Temüjin and Kasar had caught. It was a minor theft by absolute standards, but in context it was a profound violation. Temüjin confronted Behter. Words escalated. Behter dismissed him, turned his back, walked away. And then Temüjin and Qasar shot Behter dead with arrows. They killed him from behind, like animals being hunted. Holun was horrified. She understood what had happened and why, but she also understood what it meant. Her sons had killed their own brother over food. The family was fracturing from within. She berated Temüjin, calling him a killer, comparing him to a wild beast that devours its own kind, reminding him that survival required unity, not fratricide. Her words cut deep, but the deed was done. Temüjin had crossed a line. He had learned that violence could solve problems, and he had learned that he was capable of using it, even against family. The killing of Behter also revealed something else. Temüjin was willing to take extreme action to defend his interests. He would not accept subordination, even from an older brother. He would not tolerate theft or disrespect. This willingness to escalate, to use lethal force when challenged, would become a defining characteristic. It made him dangerous, and it made him a leader. The Taichiuds, the clan that had abandoned Temüjin's family, heard about the killing. They decided that Temüjin was becoming dangerous. A young man willing to kill his own half-brother might eventually seek revenge against those who had wronged his family. Better to deal with him now, while he was still weak. They raided the family's camp and took Temüjin prisoner. They fitted him with a wooden collar, a device called a kangwe, which locked around his neck and prevented him from feeding himself or lying down comfortably. The kangwe was heavy and awkward, designed to humiliate as much as to restrain. He was paraded through Taichiud camps as a warning. This is what happens to upstarts. For days, Temüjin was displayed like a trophy. He was given minimal food and water. He slept on the ground, unable to find a comfortable position with the kangwe around his neck. Children mocked him. Adults ignored him. He was a prisoner, a nobody, a boy with pretensions who had been put in his place. But Temüjin did not internalize the humiliation. He watched. He observed the routines of his captors. He noted when the guards changed, when they drank, when their attention wandered. He waited. But Temüjin did not accept his fate. During a celebration, when his captors were drinking fermented mare's milk and distracted by festivities, he struck a guard with the kangwe, using it as a weapon, and ran. The heavy wooden collar made running difficult, but he pushed through the pain and awkwardness. The Taichiuds pursued him, shouting, mounting horses, spreading out to search. He hid in a river, submerged except for his face, lying in the cold water for hours as search parties passed nearby. A Taichiud named Sorkunshira found him, but did not raise the alarm. Instead, he told Temüjin to stay hidden until the search moved on, then to run. Why Sorkunshira helped him is not recorded. Perhaps he saw something in the young man, a spark of potential or a quality worth preserving. Perhaps he disapproved of the Taichiud's treatment of Yesugei's family, saw it as dishonorable to hound a widow and her children. Perhaps he simply made a gamble that Temüjin would remember the favor and repay it someday. Whatever the reason, Temüjin escaped. He returned to his family. He was 16 years old, landless, resourceless, with a history of violence and escape. By any reasonable measure, his prospects were grim. The Taichiuds had tried to break him and nearly succeeded. He had been humiliated publicly, treated as a criminal and a nobody. Most young men would have accepted their low status, would have lived quiet lives on the margins, surviving but not thriving. But Temüjin did not accept. He had survived. And he had begun to understand how the world worked. Loyalty was not automatic. It had to be earned. Power was not inherited. It had to be taken. And the steppe's rigid hierarchies were not laws of nature. They were constructs, and constructs could be rebuilt. Temüjin began to gather followers. He started with childhood friends, people who knew him before his family's fall. Bo-Orchu, the son of a wealthy family, joined him after Temüjin helped recover stolen horses. Bo-Orchu was well off and had no material reason to follow a landless exile, but he was impressed by Temüjin's determination and skill. He chose to follow based on personal judgment, not tribal obligation. Gelme, a servant from his father's household, offered his service. Gelme's family had served the Borjigin clan, and he felt loyalty to Yesugei's memory. But he stayed with Temüjin by choice, not compulsion. These were not men compelled by tribal obligation. They chose to follow Temüjin, and that was new. Traditionally, loyalty on the steppe flowed from kinship or force. You followed your father's clan because you were born into it. You followed a strong chieftain because he could protect you or because he could punish you if you did not. Temüjin offered a third option: follow me because I will reward you. Follow me because I am going somewhere. Follow me because I recognize your worth and will elevate you based on your ability. The proposition was audacious, but it worked. He also sought out powerful patrons. He approached Togrul Khan, leader of the Kerate tribe, who had once been friends with Yesugei. Temüjin addressed him as father, using the language of kinship to invoke old obligations, and offered him gifts: sable pelts his wife Berta had brought as dowry. The furs were valuable, a significant sacrifice for a man as poor as Temüjin, but the gesture demonstrated seriousness. Togrul accepted the overture. He agreed to help Temüjin rebuild what his father had lost. Why? Perhaps out of genuine affection for Yesugei's memory. Perhaps because he saw an opportunity to gain a loyal subordinate who might prove useful. Perhaps because patronage was a way of accumulating political capital, of binding ambitious young men to his service. Again, the reasons mattered less than the result. Temüjin now had a powerful ally. Shortly after, disaster struck again. The Merkits, the tribe from which Temüjin's mother had been kidnapped decades earlier, raided Temüjin's camp in retaliation. They did not find him, but they found Berta. They took her, dragging her away in the night, while Temüjin and his brothers hid in the forest. This was retaliation, blood for blood, a kidnapping to answer the kidnapping of Hoelun. The Merkits had waited years for an opportunity, and now they had taken it. Temüjin was enraged. Berta was not just his wife. She was his partner, the woman who had believed in him when he had nothing, who had brought resources to their marriage in the form of her dowry, who had stood by him through poverty and hardship. Her kidnapping was a personal violation, but it was also a political challenge. If Temüjin could not protect his own wife, how could he claim to lead warriors? How could he ask men to follow him if he could not defend his household? But rage without power achieves nothing. Temüjin swallowed his fury and calculated. He went to Togrul Khan and begged for help. This was humiliating. He was asking his patron to risk men and resources to solve a personal problem, but Togrul agreed, perhaps out of sympathy, perhaps because failing to help would damage his own reputation. Togrul also brought in a third party, a young chieftain named Jamuka, who had been Temüjin's close friend in childhood. The two had sworn blood brotherhood years before, cutting their hands and mixing their blood, vowing eternal loyalty. Together they raised an army of 20,000 men and attacked the Merkits. The campaign was swift and brutal. The Mongol coalition swept through Merkit territory, burning camps, scattering herds, killing warriors. They recovered Berta along with many other captives. She was pregnant. The child, a boy named Yochi, was born months later. Was he Temujin's son or the product of Berta's captivity? No one knew. Temujin claimed him as his own, publicly and without hesitation. But the question lingered, a shadow over Yochi's legitimacy that would poison his relationships with his brothers and complicate succession disputes for decades. The campaign against the Merkits established Temujin as a man of action. He had assembled a coalition, executed a military operation, and achieved his objective. This was not a minor raid. It was a coordinated campaign involving multiple tribes, demonstrating organizational skill and the ability to inspire others to risk their lives for his cause. Other men began to take notice. Some joined his camp. His following grew from a handful of loyal companions to a substantial warband. But so did the complexity of his relationships. Jamuka was his blood brother, bound by oaths of loyalty that were considered sacred on the steppe. But Jamuka was also a rival. Both men were ambitious, both were attracting followers, both were young, capable, and hungry for power. And the steppe was too small for two rising stars. For a time, Temujin and Jamuka traveled together. They led their people in tandem, a dual leadership arrangement that seemed to work initially. They hunted together, raided together, shared resources and decision-making, but the arrangement was inherently unstable. Followers began choosing sides. Some preferred Jamuka, some preferred Temujin, and their reasons revealed a fundamental difference in vision. Jamuka represented the traditional aristocratic order. He came from noble lineage, from families that had held power for generations. He believed in hierarchy, in the rightness of birth-determining status. He thought the steppe should be organized according to ancient customs, with power flowing through bloodlines and established clans maintaining their privileges. Temujin represented something else. He promoted men based on ability, not birth. He drew followers from lower classes, from people who had been excluded or marginalized by the traditional system. He promised that talent, not blood, would determine rank. This was revolutionary. It was also threatening to everyone who benefited from the old order. The break came during a seasonal migration. Jamuka suggested they camp in one location, near good pasture, but in territory he controlled. Temujin chose another, citing better strategic positioning. The decision was ostensibly about logistics, but it was really about power. Who would make the final call? Whose judgment would prevail? The followers split. Those who valued tradition and aristocratic privilege followed Jamuka. Those who believed in meritocracy and social mobility followed Temujin. From that point forward, the two men were enemies. The steppe descended into war, not just between Temujin and Jamuka, but among all the tribes. The Mongol world was fragmenting into coalitions and counter-coalitions. Alliances formed and dissolved. Battles were fought, some large, some small, all brutal. Prisoners were taken and executed. Jamuka, after one victory, had 70 of Temujin's men boiled alive in cauldrons, a horrific punishment designed to terrorize. The cruelty was deliberate. It was meant to send a message.
Resist and you will not just die, you will die in agony. But the atrocity backfired. Many of Jamuka's followers were horrified. They had signed up for war, not torture. They saw Jamuka as cruel and unstable, a leader driven by rage rather than strategy. Some defected to Temujin. They saw him as disciplined, as a man who killed, when necessary, but did not indulge in sadism. The contrast mattered.
People wanted to believe they were fighting for something more than survival. Temujin gave them that belief. He offered a vision of a unified steppe ruled by merit, where loyalty would be rewarded and ability recognized. Temujin's core strategy was integration. After defeating an enemy tribe, He did not simply loot and leave, he absorbed them. Skilled warriors were incorporated into his army, assigned to units where they could prove themselves. Craftsmen, shamans, administrators were given roles in his growing organization. Orphans and widows were adopted into Mongol clans, given protection and resources. This was unprecedented. Traditionally, conquered peoples were enslaved or exterminated, their resources seized, their identity erased. Temüjin saw waste in that approach. He saw human capital. Every person absorbed into the Mongol Confederation made it stronger. The policy was pragmatic, but it also reshaped the steppe's social fabric. Identity became less about blood and more about allegiance. You became Mongol not by being born Mongol, but by joining the Mongol cause and proving your loyalty. This policy attracted people. Warriors who had been marginalized in their own tribes found opportunities in Temüjin's army. Talented individuals who had been held back by birth status discovered they could rise based on merit. The message spread. Join Temüjin and you will be judged by what you can do, not who your father was. For a society obsessed with lineage and hereditary privilege, this was revolutionary. By 1203, Temüjin had defeated most of his rivals on the eastern steppe. The Karaite tribe, led by Togrul Khan, was the last major obstacle. Togrul had been Temüjin's patron, the man who had helped him recover Birte, who had supported his rise. But their relationship had soured. Togrul's sons, particularly Sengum, saw Temüjin as a threat. He had grown too powerful, too independent. They convinced their father to betray him. Togrul lured Temüjin into a trap under the pretense of a marriage alliance. He proposed that his granddaughter marry one of Temüjin's sons, a proposal that seemed to cement their relationship. Temüjin was invited to a feast to finalize the arrangement. But the feast was an ambush. Temüjin learned of the plot just in time, warned by a sympathetic member of the Karaite tribe who sent a secret message. He escaped, but his army was scattered in the confusion. He retreated to a remote lake called Baljuna, with only a handful of followers, perhaps 19 men in total. This was the lowest point of his rise. He had lost almost everything. His army was destroyed, his allies scattered or dead, his supplies gone. He stood at a desolate lake in the middle of nowhere, with fewer than 20 men surrounded by enemies, with no clear path forward. Most leaders would have given up, would have sued for peace or fled into exile. But Temüjin did not give up. He and his followers drank muddy water from the lake and swore an oath. They would stay together, they would rebuild, they would reclaim what had been lost. They would remember who had betrayed them and who had remained loyal. The men who stayed with Temüjin at Baljuna became the core of his inner circle. They had proven their loyalty in the worst possible circumstances. They had chosen to stand with him when he had nothing to offer but hardship and danger. Temüjin would never forget that. Years later, when he ruled an empire, the Baljuna Covenant, as it came to be called, remained the gold standard of loyalty. Those who had been at Baljuna held special status, honored above others, rewarded with land and titles and wealth. He regrouped over the following months, rebuilt his forces by calling in old alliances and attracting new followers who had heard of his resilience. He sent messages to tribes and clans, reminding them of past favors, promising future rewards, appealing to their self-interest. Slowly, his army grew, and then he launched a counterattack. The Karaites were caught off guard. They had assumed Temüjin was finished, scattered, and broken. They were not prepared for a coordinated assault. Temüjin's forces struck at night, using speed and surprise to offset their smaller numbers. The battle was chaotic and brutal. Togrul Khan fled and was killed by border guards who did not recognize him, who saw only an old man traveling alone and killed him for his belongings. His head was later brought to Temüjin, who reportedly wept. He had genuinely respected Togrul, had seen him as a father figure. But respect did not prevent him from destroying the Kerite tribe. He absorbed the Kerite people and their substantial resources, gaining thousands of warriors, vast herds of horses and livestock, and control of valuable grazing territories. Then he turned to the Naimans, the last independent power on the western steppe. The Naiman Khan, Tayang Khan, was arrogant and underestimated the Mongols. He believed his forces were superior, his warriors more skilled. He was wrong. In 1204, at the Battle of Chakirmaut, Temüjin destroyed the Naiman army. Tayang Khan died in battle, and his forces disintegrated. The steppe was unified for the first time in living memory. In 1206, a great assembly called a Kurultai was convened on the banks of the Onon River. All the tribes of Mongolia gathered, tens of thousands of people, forming a vast encampment that stretched for miles. Shamans performed rituals, sacrificing horses and sheep, reading omens in the smoke and entrails, declaring that the eternal blue sky favored Temüjin. And the assembled chieftains, representing all the tribes of the Mongol nation, proclaimed Temüjin as Genghis Khan, a title meaning universal ruler or oceanic ruler. The exact translation is disputed by scholars, but the meaning was clear. He was no longer a tribal leader. He was the supreme authority over a unified Mongol nation. Genghis Khan immediately set about reorganizing Mongol society. He broke up the old tribal structures, which had been sources of division and conflict, and replaced them with a military hierarchy based on a decimal system. Warriors were organized into units of 10 called an arban. 10 arbans formed 100 called a jagan. 10 jagans formed 1,000 called a mingan. 10 mingans formed a tumen, a unit of 10,000, the largest operational division in the Mongol army. This system had several advantages. It was simple and scalable, easy to understand and implement across diverse populations. It mixed warriors from different tribes, preventing any single tribe from maintaining an independent power base that could challenge central authority. It created clear lines of command and communication, eliminating the confusion that had plagued tribal warfare. And it allowed for rapid coordination of forces across vast distances. Orders could flow down the chain efficiently, and reports could flow back up with remarkable speed. But the decimal system was more than just organizational efficiency. It was social engineering on a grand scale. By breaking up tribal units and mixing men from different backgrounds, Genghis Khan was creating a new identity. Warriors stopped thinking of themselves primarily as Merkits, or Naimans, or Tatars. They became Mongols, defined by their service to the Khan and their membership in their arban, jagun, or mingan. Loyalty shifted from tribe to unit, from blood to brotherhood forged in battle. The system also created opportunities for rapid advancement that had never existed before. A talented warrior from a humble background could rise through the ranks based solely on performance. If he distinguished himself in battle, showed tactical intelligence, demonstrated leadership ability, he could be promoted to command 100, then 1,000, potentially even 10,000 men. This was revolutionary in a society that had been rigidly hierarchical for centuries. Genghis Khan personally oversaw the selection of commanders for the tumens, the 10,000-man units that were the empire's primary striking forces. These were positions of immense power and responsibility. The men chosen were almost always proven warriors who had demonstrated not just courage, but strategic thinking, logistical ability, and absolute loyalty. Many came from humble origins. Subutai, who would become perhaps the greatest general in Mongol history, was the son of a blacksmith. Jebe had been an enemy warrior who had shot Genghis Khan's horse out from under him in battle, then surrendered and asked to serve. Genghis Khan, impressed by his honesty and skill, gave him command and a new name meaning arrow. The Mongol military system also emphasized mobility and self-sufficiency to an extraordinary degree. Each warrior was expected to maintain multiple horses, typically 3 to 5, allowing for rapid movement and endurance over long distances. Mongol ponies were small by the standards of European war horses, but they were incredibly tough, able to survive on minimal forage, to endure extreme temperatures, to travel day after day without breaking down. A Mongol army could cover 70 to 100 kilometers in a day when necessary, a pace that seemed impossible to sedentary armies accustomed to slower, more methodical movement. Warriors carried everything they needed with them: dried meat, curdled milk, leather bottles for water, and kumis, the fermented mare's milk that was a staple of the steppe diet. They could go days without stopping to cook or forage, living off their supplies and the blood of their horses, which they would tap without killing the animal. This self-sufficiency meant Mongol armies did not need the massive supply trains that slowed down other military forces. They could strike fast, hit hard, and disappear before the enemy could organize a response. The Mongol bow was another crucial technological advantage. It was a composite recurve bow made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew glued together and shaped into a distinctive, curved form. These bows were incredibly powerful, capable of penetrating armor at distances up to 200 meters. They were also designed to be used from horseback, shorter than European longbows but more powerful pound for pound. A skilled Mongol archer could shoot accurately at full gallop, loosing arrows in rapid succession, hitting targets in front, to the sides, or even behind him. Training began in childhood and never stopped. Even veteran warriors practiced regularly, honing their skills, maintaining the edge that made them effective. Hunting expeditions served as training exercises, teaching men to coordinate movements, to follow orders, to function as units rather than individuals. Large-scale hunts called nurj involved thousands of men surrounding vast areas of steppe, gradually tightening the circle over days or weeks, driving all the game toward a killing ground. These hunts trained men in the same tactics they would use in war: encirclement, coordination across vast distances, patience, discipline, and the final devastating assault. Warriors were assigned to units regardless of their tribal origin. A Mongol might serve alongside a former Karaite, a Naiman, a Merkit. What mattered was not where you came from, but whether you followed orders and fought effectively. Commanders were promoted based on merit, not lineage. A commoner who demonstrated skill and loyalty could rise to command a mingun or even a tumen. An aristocrat who proved incompetent would be demoted or removed. This meritocratic system destroyed the power of the old aristocracy and created a new order loyal to Genghis Khan personally. He also promulgated a legal code called the Yasa, which imposed harsh penalties for theft, adultery, and betrayal, but also protected the rights of widows and orphans, regulated hunting practices to preserve game populations, and established rules for the distribution of plunder. The Yasa was not written down in full, at least not in any copy that survives, but its principles were enforced rigorously. Judges called jaguchis traveled throughout Mongol territories, hearing cases and rendering verdicts based on the Yasa. Punishments were severe. Theft was punishable by death. So was desertion in battle, betrayal of trust, and lying to a superior. But the law applied to everyone equally. A noble who stole was executed just as a commoner would be. This equal application of law was unusual and created a sense that justice, however harsh, was fair. Religious tolerance was enshrined as policy. Shamans, Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, all were protected under Mongol law. Genghis Khan decreed that religious leaders of all faiths were exempt from taxation and military service. Temples, churches, and mosques were not to be destroyed or desecrated. This was partly pragmatic. The Mongols ruled diverse peoples and could not afford to alienate them over theology, but it also reflected Genghis Khan's worldview. He believed in the eternal blue sky, Tengri, the steppe deity who granted him authority. But he did not believe Tengri required the suppression of other gods. Let people worship as they pleased, as long as they obeyed Mongol law. This tolerance was remarkable for its time and allowed the Mongol Empire to govern a vast, religiously diverse population without constant religious strife. With the steppe unified, Genghis Khan turned his attention outward. The Mongols needed wealth. The steppe provided horses and warriors, grass and mobility, but it did not provide grain, textiles, metal goods, or luxury items. Those came from sedentary civilizations. Traditionally, nomadic tribes raided settled peoples or extracted tribute through threats of violence. Genghis Khan saw a larger opportunity. If the Mongols could conquer agricultural societies, they could control resources permanently, could integrate the production of settled peoples into the Mongol economy. The first target was Xia, a kingdom in what is now northwestern China, located along the trade routes between China and Central Asia. Xia was wealthy but militarily weak, its army small and its defenses inadequate. In 1209, Mongol forces invaded. The campaign was a test, a way of evaluating Mongol capabilities against a fortified enemy. The Mongols besieged Xia's capital, but they lacked the technology and experience to take it quickly. The siege dragged on. Eventually, the Xia emperor sued for peace and agreed to pay tribute in the form of silk, camels, and military support for future Mongol campaigns. Genghis Khan accepted. He did not yet have the resources to conquer and hold Xia's cities permanently, but he had established dominance. The message was sent. The Mongols were no longer a steppe problem. They were a regional threat. Next came the Jin dynasty, which ruled northern China. The Jin were powerful. They commanded large armies, fortified cities, sophisticated siege equipment. They had been extracting tribute from the steppe tribes for decades, playing them off against each other, ensuring that no unified threat emerged. By all conventional measures, they should have been able to crush the Mongols. But the Mongols did not fight conventionally. In 1211, Genghis Khan invaded Jin territory with an army of perhaps 100,000 men. Mongol cavalry swept through the countryside, avoiding direct assaults on cities initially. They destroyed Jin armies in the field, cut supply lines, isolated garrisons, and besieged key fortresses. The Mongol strategy was to devastate the agricultural base that supported the Jin military, to destroy crops and irrigation systems, to render the countryside unable to supply the cities. This was total war, aimed not just at defeating armies, but at breaking the economic foundation of enemy power. When they lacked siege technology, they captured engineers and forced them to build catapults, trebuchets, and siege towers. The Mongols learned fast. They watched how Chinese siege engineers operated, asked questions, experimented, and integrated the technology into their military system. Within a few years, Mongol armies that had known nothing about siege warfare were conducting complex siege operations with skill and efficiency. By 1215, they had taken Beijing, the Jin capital. The siege was long and brutal. The city's defenses were formidable, its walls high and thick, its garrison large and well supplied. But the Mongols surrounded the city completely, cutting off all supply routes, and waited. Starvation did much of the work. When the city finally fell, it was looted systematically. The population was slaughtered or enslaved. Buildings were burned. The destruction was immense. The Jin dynasty retreated south and continued to resist, establishing a new capital and rebuilding its armies, but its northern territories were lost. The Beijing campaign demonstrated Mongol adaptability. They had begun as pure cavalry nomads, warriors who fought from horseback with bows, and who knew nothing of fortifications or urban warfare. Within a few years, they had mastered siege warfare, logistics, and the coordination of infantry and cavalry operations. They did this by absorbing knowledge from conquered peoples. Chinese engineers, Khitan administrators, Uyghur scribes, all were incorporated into the Mongol war machine. Genghis Khan had no interest in preserving ethnic purity. He wanted capability. If a Muslim engineer could build a better catapult than a Mongol, the Muslim was promoted and rewarded. This meritocratic ruthlessness made the Mongol army extraordinarily effective. While the Jin campaign continued under subordinate commanders, Genghis Khan turned west. In Central Asia, the Khwarezmian Empire controlled a vast territory stretching from modern-day Afghanistan through Iran to the borders of Iraq. Its ruler, Shah Muhammad II, commanded enormous wealth derived from controlling the Silk Road trade routes, and he fielded large armies. He was arrogant and secure in his power, convinced of his superiority over the steppe nomads. When Mongol ambassadors arrived in 1218 to propose trade relations, Muhammad initially agreed. The Mongols wanted access to markets, wanted to trade horses and furs for textiles and metalwork. It was a reasonable proposal, but then a Mongol caravan of 450 merchants was massacred by the governor of Otrar, a border city. The governor, Inalchuk, accused the merchants of being spies and executed them, seizing their goods. Whether the merchants were actually spies is unknown, but Inalchuk's actions were a catastrophic provocation. Genghis Khan sent envoys demanding that Inalchuk be handed over for punishment. This was a reasonable request, a way to resolve the conflict without war. But Muhammad refused. Instead, he killed one envoy and sent the others back with their beards shaved, a deliberate insult that signaled contempt. He had made a fatal mistake. He had assumed the Mongols were just another steppe tribe, a nuisance that could be dismissed. He did not understand who he was dealing with. Genghis Khan's response was methodical. He spent months assembling an army of approximately 150,000 men, gathering intelligence about Khwarezmian defenses, mapping routes through the mountains and deserts that separated Mongolia from Central Asia. He divided his forces into multiple columns, each with a specific objective, and invaded Khwarezm in 1219. The Mongol strategy was to move quickly, strike multiple targets simultaneously, and prevent the Khwarezmians from concentrating their forces. Subutai, one of Genghis Khan's most brilliant generals, led a diversionary force that pursued Shah Muhammad across the empire, giving him no time to organize a defense or rally his armies. The Shah fled from city to city, never standing to fight, his authority collapsing as his subjects watched him run. Meanwhile, other Mongol columns systematically besieged and captured Khwarezmian cities. Bukhara fell first. The garrison, seeing the size of the Mongol army and recognizing that resistance was futile, fled during the night. The Mongols entered the city and ordered the population to evacuate, then looted everything of value and burned the rest. Genghis Khan reportedly stood in Bukhara's great mosque and declared that he was the punishment of God, sent because the people had sinned. Whether he actually said this is uncertain. The story was recorded by later chroniclers, possibly embellished or invented, but it illustrates how Genghis Khan framed his conquests. He was not merely a warlord seeking plunder, he was an agent of divine will, executing heaven's judgment on the corrupt and the unjust. Samarkand, one of the greatest cities in Central Asia, fell next. The city was a jewel of Islamic civilization, a center of learning and trade, with a population in the hundreds of thousands. The Mongols besieged it with overwhelming force, surrounding it completely and bombarding it with siege engines. After a few days, the garrison attempted a breakout, hoping to fight their way through the Mongol lines. They were slaughtered in the open field. The city surrendered. The Mongols spared artisans and craftsmen, people with valuable skills, but killed or enslaved most of the population. The city's wealth, accumulated over centuries, was plundered, libraries were burned, mosques were desecrated. Then the Mongols moved on. the siege of Urgench, the Khwarezmian capital, was more difficult. The city was heavily fortified and defended by a large, determined garrison. It resisted for months, through winter into spring. The fighting was house to house, brutal and exhausting. When the city finally fell, the Mongols diverted a river to flood it, ensuring that it could never be used as a base of resistance again. The entire city was destroyed, the population was killed or scattered, the devastation was total. This was not random barbarity, it was calculated terror. Genghis Khan wanted the world to understand that resistance would be met with annihilation. Cities that surrendered immediately were often spared, their populations allowed to live under Mongol rule. Cities that resisted were obliterated, their populations slaughtered, their buildings razed. The choice was stark and deliberate. The Khwarezmian campaign took approximately 2 years and destroyed one of the most powerful empires in the Islamic world. Shah Muhammad died in hiding on an island in the Caspian Sea, broken and defeated, alone, except for a handful of servants. His son Jalal ad-Din continued to resist, gathering an army and fighting several battles against Mongol forces, but his forces were crushed at the Battle of the Indus River in 1221. Jalal ad-Din escaped by riding his horse off a cliff into the river and swimming to the far bank, but his empire was gone. The Mongols controlled Central Asia. During this campaign, Subutai and another general, Jebe, asked permission to pursue the fleeing Shah further. Genghis Khan granted it, authorizing what became one of the most extraordinary military expeditions in history. Subutai and Jebe led a force of 20,000 men on a reconnaissance raid that would cover over 8,000 kilometers and last 3 years. They swept through Persia, skirted the southern shore of the Caspian Sea, entered the Caucasus, defeated a Georgian army, and emerged onto the Russian steppe. There they encountered the Cumans, a Turkic nomadic people who controlled the southern Russian steppes. The Cumans fled north and sought help from the Russ's princes, the leaders of the various principalities that made up medieval Russia. The Rus assembled a coalition army, perhaps 80,000 men, and marched to meet the Mongols. At the Battle of Kalka River in 1223, the Mongols annihilated them. The Russ's forces lacked coordination. Each prince commanded his own contingent and refused to subordinate himself to overall command. The Mongols exploited this disunity, using feigned retreats to draw out and isolate portions of the Russ's army, then surrounding and destroying them piecemeal. Tens of thousands of Russ's warriors died. Then, having accomplished their reconnaissance and taught the Russians a harsh lesson, Subutai and Jebe returned to Mongolia. This campaign was extraordinary. A Mongol force had traveled thousands of kilometers through hostile territory, defeated multiple enemies, gathered intelligence about lands and peoples the Mongols had never encountered before, and returned home intact. No army in history had demonstrated such mobility, endurance, and operational independence. The raid also served notice to Europe. Mongol scouts had reached the fringes of Christendom. They had seen what lay beyond the steppe, and they had found it vulnerable. Genghis Khan returned to Mongolia in 1225. He was aging now, in his 60s, an advanced age for the time and especially for a man who had lived such a hard life. His body bore the accumulated damage of decades of warfare, countless injuries and deprivations. But he was not finished. Shah had failed to provide troops for the Khwarezmian campaign, a breach of their tributary obligations. They had promised military support, but had sent excuses instead. Genghis Khan decided to punish them. In 1226 he invaded Xia. The campaign was brutal, more so than previous campaigns. Cities were sacked with particular ferocity. Populations were massacred without mercy. The Mongols showed no restraint. This was personal. Xia had betrayed their agreement. They would be erased. During the campaign, Genghis Khan fell from his horse while hunting. Accounts vary on the details. Some sources say he was injured during a siege, struck by an arrow or falling debris. Others say he fell ill with fever. The specifics are lost to history. What is certain is that he did not recover. His condition worsened over the following weeks. In August 1227, Genghis Khan died. He was approximately 65 years old. His final orders were to keep his death secret until Xia was completely destroyed. His generals obeyed. The campaign continued. When the Xia emperor finally surrendered, he was executed. The dynasty was extinguished. The kingdom was incorporated into the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan's body was transported back to Mongolia in great secrecy. His funeral escort followed ancient steppe tradition. Anyone who saw the procession was killed to preserve the secrecy of the burial site. The location was somewhere near Burkhan Khaldun, the sacred mountain where Genghis Khan had hidden during his youth, where he had prayed to Tengri and sworn to avenge himself on his enemies, but the exact spot was never marked. Forests were planted over the area, rivers were diverted to confuse future searchers. The earth was trampled by thousands of horses until no trace remained, and so the man who had conquered half the known world disappeared into the ground, leaving no monument but his empire. That empire did not die with him. Genghis Khan had prepared for succession carefully. His 4 sons by birth were Yochi, Chagatai, Ogadai, and Tolui. Each had been given territories to govern, training them in administration and military command. Yochi had died before his father, possibly murdered on Genghis Khan's orders, possibly from illness. The question of Jochi's paternity had never been resolved, and the ambiguity had poisoned relations among the brothers. Chagatai despised Jochi and had spread rumors that he was illegitimate, the son of a merkit rapist rather than Genghis Khan. Ogadai was more diplomatic, skilled at mediating between factions. Tolui, the youngest, was competent and respected but not ambitious for supreme leadership. Before his death, Genghis Khan had designated Ogadai as his successor. The choice was pragmatic. Ogadai was capable but not threatening, diplomatic but firm, respected by his brothers and the army. In 1229, a Kurultai confirmed the choice. Ogadai became the second great Khan of the Mongol Empire. Ogadai continued his father's policies and expanded on them. He built the capital city of Karakoram on the Orkhon River, transforming it from a seasonal camp into a permanent administrative center. He constructed palaces, storehouses, and workshops. He invited artisans, merchants, and scholars from across the empire. Karakoram became a cosmopolitan city where Chinese engineers worked alongside Persian astronomers, where Buddhist monks debated with Nestorian Christians, where Muslim merchants traded with Russian slaves. He also expanded the empire's administrative apparatus. Ogadai established a postal system called the Yam, a network of relay stations spaced a day's ride apart across the empire. Couriers carrying official messages could change horses at each station, allowing them to cover vast distances quickly. The Yam enabled rapid communication between the capital and distant provinces, allowing the Khan to issue orders and receive reports with unprecedented speed. It also facilitated trade, as merchants could use the system under certain circumstances. Ogadai launched new campaigns to consolidate and expand Mongol power. The Jin dynasty in China, which had resisted Mongol conquest for decades, was finally destroyed in 1234. Mongol forces swept into Korea, forcing it into tributary status after a series of brutal invasions. And in the West, Ogadai authorized the invasion of Europe, the campaign that would bring Mongol armies to the gates of Vienna. The European campaign was commanded by Batu Khan, Yochi's son, with Subutai, now an old man, but still the empire's greatest strategist, serving as chief military planner. In 1237, Mongol armies crossed the Volga River and entered the principalities of Russia. The cities fell one after another, each conquest following the same pattern. The Mongols arrived, surrounded the city, demanded surrender, and if surrender was refused, they besieged and destroyed. Ryazan fell first. The Mongols sent envoys demanding 1/10 of everything, 1/10 of the population as slaves, 1/10 of the horses, 1/10 of the wealth. The Russ's prince refused. The Mongols besieged the city for 5 days, then stormed it. The entire population was slaughtered. Not one person was left alive. The city was burned to the ground. Vladimir fell next, then Suzdal, then Moscow, a minor town at the time, but strategically located. The Mongols employed their standard tactics. They arrived in winter when rivers were frozen and served as highways for cavalry, when the snow limited the defenders' ability to forage or escape. They surrounded cities completely, cutting off all supply routes, preventing anyone from entering or leaving. They bombarded the walls with siege engines, creating breaches. Then they stormed through, killing systematically. In 1240, Kiev, the greatest city of Rus', the mother of Russian cities, was stormed. It was reduced to rubble. The population was slaughtered. A traveller passing through years later reported that the city was still filled with bones, that you could walk for miles without seeing a building still standing. From Rus', the Mongols moved west into Poland and Hungary. In Poland, the Mongol vanguard encountered a European army at Legnica. The Europeans were confident. They had heavy cavalry, armoured knights who had dominated European battlefields for centuries, men encased in steel riding massive war horses. The Mongols met them with feigned retreat, a tactic they had perfected over decades. The European knights charged after what they thought was a fleeing enemy. The Mongols turned and encircled them. Mongol archers picked them apart from a distance, shooting horses, targeting gaps in armor, using their superior mobility to stay out of reach. The knights were slaughtered. The European tactics designed for close-quarters melee combat were useless against an enemy that refused to engage directly. 2 days later, the main Mongol army under Subutai met the Hungarian forces at the Battle of Mohi on the Saju River. The Hungarians had fortified a camp on the west bank and believed they were safe behind their defences. The Mongols assaulted the camp from multiple directions, crossing the river under cover of darkness, using pontoon bridges they had constructed upstream. When the Hungarians woke to find Mongol forces inside their camp, panic spread. The battle became a massacre. When the Hungarians broke and fled, the Mongols pursued them for miles, cutting them down from horseback, hunting them like animals. Tens of thousands of Hungarians died. Central Europe lay open. The Mongols prepared to advance further into Germany and Italy. And then Ögedei Khan died in December 1241. The news reached Batu and Subutai in early 1242. Mongol law required all princes of the blood to return to Mongolia for the Kurultai that would elect the next great Khan. Batu was a grandson of Genghis Khan and a senior prince. He had to go back. The European campaign was suspended. The Mongol armies withdrew, retreating back across the Hungarian plain, across the Russian steppes, back to Mongolia. Europe exhaled. They did not understand why they had been spared. Some credited divine intervention, believed that God or the Virgin Mary had turned back the horde. The Pope declared it a miracle and called for a crusade, though none materialized. In fact, it was politics and law. The Mongol Empire operated by consensus among the royal family. Major decisions, including the election of a new Khan, required the participation of all eligible princes. Batu could not continue the campaign alone, and by the time the Kurultai concluded and a new Khan was elected, the strategic moment had passed. The element of surprise was gone. The Europeans were preparing defences. The Mongols never returned to Europe in force. The Kurultai of 1246 elected Guyuk Khan, Ogedei's eldest son. Guyuk's reign was brief and contentious. He despised Batu, resented his power and independence. The two men had clashed during the European campaign, and Guyuk had never forgiven the perceived insults. He planned to move against Batu, to strip him of his territories and perhaps execute him, but he died in 1248, possibly poisoned, before he could act. The empire entered a period of internal conflict and uncertainty. Batu supported Mungke, Tolui's eldest son, for the Khanate. Ogedei's and Chaghatay's descendants opposed him, fearing that power was shifting to Tolui's line. In 1251, Mungke was elected through a controversial Kurultai that excluded his rivals and was dominated by Batu's supporters. The legitimacy of the election was disputed, but Mungke had the military power to enforce his claim. He immediately purged potential challengers, executing dozens of princes and officials who had opposed him or were suspected of disloyalty. The purge consolidated his power, but deepened fractures within the family. The Mongol Empire was beginning to fragment. Mungke launched new campaigns to distract from internal divisions and to continue the expansion that had always been the empire's driving force. His brother Hulagu was sent west to deal with threats in Persia. The primary target was the Nizari Ismaili state, known to Europeans as the Assassins. The Assassins operated from a network of mountain fortresses scattered across Persia and Syria. They had terrorized the region for decades, killing political leaders, spreading fear, operating as a state within states. They were Shia Muslims who practiced political murder as a religious duty, and they were widely hated and feared. Hulagu besieged their strongholds one by one, methodically reducing the fortresses that had been considered impregnable. In 1256, the assassins surrendered. Their leader, the Imam, was taken to Mungke Khan in Mongolia, where he was executed. The fortresses were destroyed. The cult was extinguished. The threat that had haunted the Islamic world for over a century was eliminated in a single campaign. Hulagu then turned to the Abbasid Caliphate. The Abbasids ruled from Baghdad and claimed spiritual leadership of the Islamic world. Their political power had waned over the centuries, but they remained symbolically important. The Caliph was the successor to the Prophet Muhammad, the commander of the faithful. His authority was recognized from Spain to India. The Caliph, al-Mustasim, refused Mongol demands for submission. He was arrogant, or perhaps simply naive, believing that his religious authority would protect him, that the Mongols would not dare to harm the Caliph. He was wrong. Hulagu besieged Baghdad in 1258 with an army of perhaps 150,000 men. The city fell after 2 weeks of bombardment and assault. The Caliph was executed, allegedly wrapped in a carpet and trampled to death by horses to avoid spilling royal blood directly, though some accounts say he was simply killed with a sword. The city was sacked for days. Libraries were burned, including the House of Wisdom, a repository of centuries of Islamic scholarship, containing works of science, philosophy, mathematics, and literature. Tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, died. The Tigris River reportedly ran black with ink from destroyed books and red with the blood of scholars. Baghdad, which had been one of the greatest cities on earth, a center of learning and culture, was left a ruin. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had endured for 5 centuries, ceased to exist. The destruction of Baghdad sent shockwaves through the Islamic world. To many Muslims it was apocalyptic, a sign that the end times were approaching. The Caliph was the successor to the Prophet Muhammad, the spiritual leader of the global Muslim community. His death at the hands of pagans was unthinkable, but it had happened. And it demonstrated that the Mongols recognized no authority but their own, no sanctity but power. Hulagu continued west, entering Syria. He took Aleppo after a brutal siege, then Damascus, which surrendered without a fight. The Mediterranean coast seemed within reach. Christian crusader states sent envoys exploring alliances, hoping the Mongols would help them destroy the Muslim powers. But then news arrived from Mongolia. Mongol Khan had died in 1259 during a campaign in southern China, possibly from dysentery, possibly from an arrow wound. Hulagu, like Batu before him, had to return to Mongolia for the Kurultai. He left a reduced force in Syria under a general named Kitbuka, a Nestorian Christian. That force was met by the Mamluks of Egypt at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260. The Mamluks were themselves a warrior class, former slaves captured as children and trained from childhood to fight. They were skilled, disciplined, and led by competent commanders. They knew Mongol tactics and adapted their strategy accordingly. At Ain Jalut, the Mamluks defeated the Mongols decisively. Kitbuka was killed. The Mongol advance into the Middle East was halted. It was the first major defeat the Mongols had suffered since Genghis Khan's rise, and it shattered the aura of invincibility. Meanwhile, back in Mongolia, the empire was fracturing. Mungke's death triggered a civil war between his brothers Kublai and Arik Böke. Kublai was campaigning in southern China when he received news of Mungke's death. Arik Böke was in Karakoram, controlling the traditional Mongol heartland. Both claimed the title of Great Khan. Both held Kurultais that elected them, though neither Kurultai included all eligible princes. The empire split. Kublai controlled the east, including China and Mongolia's eastern territories. He had access to the wealth of northern China and the administrative expertise of Chinese bureaucrats. Arik Böke controlled the west, including Karakoram and the traditional Mongol grazing lands. He had the support of traditionalists who resented Kublai's adoption of Chinese customs. They fought for 4 years in a war that devastated Mongolia and strained the empire's resources. Kublai won, largely because he controlled more resources and could sustain his armies longer. Arik Böke surrendered in 1264. Kublai spared his life, but kept him under close watch. Arik Böke died 2 years later, possibly poisoned, possibly from illness. Kublai's victory did not restore unity. The empire had fractured permanently. Hulagu in Persia, Batu's successors in the Golden Horde ruling Russia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia all operated independently. They acknowledged Kublai as Great Khan in name, a ceremonial courtesy, but in practice they ruled their own domains as sovereign entities. The Mongol Empire had become 4 separate empires, sometimes allied, sometimes at war with each other. Kublai focused on China with single-minded determination. He understood that China represented the greatest prize the Mongols could win, the wealthiest and most populous civilization under heaven. He moved his capital from Karakoram to Khanbalik, modern-day Beijing, a symbolic shift that acknowledged where real power lay. The move was controversial among traditionalist Mongols who saw it as abandonment of their heritage, a surrender to Chinese ways. But Kublai understood that to rule China effectively, he had to present himself as a Chinese emperor, not just a foreign conqueror. He styled himself as the founder of the Yuan dynasty, adopting Chinese court rituals and administrative structures. He consulted with Confucian scholars, performed the traditional sacrifices to heaven and earth that Chinese emperors had performed for millennia, and presented himself as the legitimate successor to previous dynasties. This was not mere theatre. Kublai genuinely admired Chinese civilization and wanted to be seen as its legitimate ruler, not its destroyer. But he also maintained Mongol identity and traditions, creating a hybrid court culture that was unique in Chinese history. The Yuan court was bilingual and bicultural. Official documents were written in both Mongolian and Chinese. Court ceremonies blended Mongol and Chinese elements. Mongols retained military and political dominance, holding the highest offices and controlling the army. The social hierarchy placed Mongols at the top, followed by other Inner Asians who had allied with the Mongols early, then Northern Chinese and finally Southern Chinese at the bottom. This hierarchy was enforced through law and custom, reserving certain positions and privileges for Mongols. But Chinese scholars and administrators ran the bureaucracy, managed the economy, and maintained the records. Kublai recognized that China's vast population and complex economy required Chinese expertise to govern. He could not rule through Mongol warriors alone. He needed the Confucian bureaucrats who understood taxation, water management, granary systems, legal codes. He employed them, paid them well, and listened to their advice, even as he ensured that ultimate power remained in Mongol hands. This balancing act was delicate and not always successful. Kublai faced constant tension between Mongol traditionalists who wanted to preserve steppe culture and Sinophile officials who wanted him to adopt Chinese ways completely. He tried to satisfy both groups, maintaining Mongol military traditions, supporting shamanism and Tibetan Buddhism, preserving the Mongol language and customs, while also patronizing Confucian scholarship, rebuilding Chinese institutions, and presenting himself as a Chinese son of heaven. The Yuan court became a center of cultural synthesis. Mongol nobles learned Chinese, studied Confucian classics, wrote poetry in Chinese styles. Chinese officials learned Mongolian, adopted some Mongol customs, served alongside Mongol administrators. Tibetan Buddhism, which Kublai personally favored, became influential at court, creating a link between Mongol, Chinese, and Tibetan cultures. The Mongol-Tibetan relationship that Kublai established would last for centuries, shaping Tibetan Buddhism and Mongolian identity long after the Yuan dynasty fell. Kublai was also a patron of arts and sciences. He established observatories, inviting Persian and Chinese astronomers to work together, combining Islamic and Chinese astronomical knowledge. He commissioned geographical surveys and maps, wanting to understand the vast territories he ruled. He supported theatrical performances, poetry, painting, and calligraphy. The Yuan dynasty saw the development of new art forms, including Chinese opera and vernacular drama, which flourished under Mongol patronage. He rebuilt and expanded Beijing, transforming it from a war-damaged provincial city into a magnificent imperial capital. He constructed palaces, temples, gardens, and administrative buildings on a scale that impressed even jaded Chinese officials. Foreign visitors, including Marco Polo, were stunned by the city's size and splendor. Kublai's palace had halls large enough to seat thousands, parks stocked with exotic animals, artificial lakes, and mountains created by thousands of laborers. It was designed to impress, to demonstrate that the Mongols were not just conquerors but legitimate emperors capable of matching or exceeding the grandeur of previous dynasties. Yet beneath this splendor, tensions simmered. Chinese resentment of foreign rule never disappeared. The social hierarchy that privileged Mongols and other foreigners over native Chinese, especially southern Chinese, bred anger and frustration. Educated Chinese who would have held high office under native dynasties found themselves excluded from power or relegated to subordinate positions. This resentment would eventually fuel the rebellions that destroyed the Yuan dynasty. Kublai employed capable administrators regardless of ethnicity. Men like Yelu Chukai, a Khitan who had served Genghis Khan and Ogedei, helped preserve Chinese institutions while adapting them to Mongol rule. This pragmatic approach allowed the Yuan dynasty to govern China effectively, extracting resources without triggering constant rebellion. The conquest of southern China took decades. The Song dynasty, which ruled the south from its capital at Hangzhou, resisted fiercely. They had superior naval technology and controlled the Yangtze River, which served as a defensive barrier. The Song navy was large and sophisticated, equipped with paddle-wheel warships, fire lances, and even early forms of gunpowder weapons. Kublai built a navy, something the Mongols had never done before. He recruited Song defectors who brought naval expertise. He hired shipbuilders and trained sailors. He besieged Song cities methodically, sometimes taking years to reduce a single fortress. In 1279, the last Song emperor, a child named Zhao Bing, died in a naval battle when his guardian jumped into the sea, holding the boy, rather than allow him to be captured. The Song dynasty was extinguished. For the first time in centuries, all of China was united under a single ruler, and that ruler was a Mongol. Kublai was not satisfied. He launched invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281, attempting to extend Mongol power across the sea. Both failed catastrophically. The Mongol fleets, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers, were destroyed by typhoons, storms that the Japanese called kamikaze, divine winds. Thousands of Mongol and Korean soldiers drowned. The survivors were slaughtered on the beaches. The campaigns were logistical and strategic disasters that demonstrated the limits of Mongol power. Kublai also invaded Vietnam 3 times, in 1258, 1285, and 1287. All 3 invasions failed. The Vietnamese, led by brilliant commanders like Tran Hung Dao, employed guerrilla tactics, avoided direct battle, and bled the Mongol armies through attrition and disease. The Vietnamese understood their environment and used it against the invaders. They lured Mongol forces into jungles and swamps where cavalry was useless, where disease spread rapidly, where supply lines stretched to breaking. Kublai's forces could conquer open territory, could win pitched battles, but jungles and coastlines defeated them. Despite these failures, the Yuan dynasty was wealthy and cosmopolitan. Khanbaliq became a center of international trade and culture. Merchants, missionaries, and adventurers from across Eurasia traveled the Silk Road to Kublai's court, drawn by tales of wealth and opportunity. Among them was Marco Polo, a Venetian merchant who spent 17 years in Kublai's service, traveling throughout China and Southeast Asia, serving as an official and observer. Marco Polo's account of his travels, dictated after his return to Europe while he was imprisoned in Genoa, introduced Europeans to the scale and sophistication of the Mongol Empire and Yuan China. Many of his contemporaries did not believe him. His descriptions of China seemed too fantastical. Cities with millions of people, paper money, coal for fuel, postal systems, all seemed like inventions or exaggerations, but they were largely accurate. Polo had seen a civilization far more advanced than medieval Europe, and his account, despite its flaws and embellishments, provided Europeans with their first detailed glimpse of the East. The Mongol Empire at its height facilitated unprecedented exchange between East and West, North and South, creating what historians have called the first truly global economy. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, meant that a traveler could journey from the Mediterranean to the Pacific with reasonable safety, crossing thousands of miles through territories that had been at war for centuries. This was not an exaggeration or a propaganda claim. It was a measurable reality that transformed commerce and cultural exchange. Roads were maintained and patrolled by Mongol garrisons stationed at intervals along major routes. The Yam system, the postal relay network that Ögedei had established, served merchants as well as government couriers. Postal stations provided horses, food, and shelter. Merchants traveling on official business could obtain supplies and fresh mounts, allowing them to move quickly and safely. Those traveling privately still benefited from the infrastructure and the security it provided. Merchants were protected by Mongol law with a rigor that had never existed before. The Yasa prescribed death for anyone who robbed or harmed merchants. Bandits were hunted down mercilessly and executed publicly as warnings. Local officials who failed to protect traders or who extorted bribes from them were punished severely. This protection was not altruistic. The Mongols understood that trade generated wealth, and wealth generated taxes. A thriving merchant class enriched the empire. Therefore, merchants were treated as valuable assets to be protected and encouraged. The Mongols also standardized weights, measures, and commercial practices across their empire, making trade easier and reducing disputes. They issued passports called paisa, metal tablets engraved with the Khan's authority, which granted bearers safe passage and access to the yam system. Different levels of paisa existed, made of gold, silver, or bronze, each conferring different privileges. A merchant with a gold paisa could requisition horses and supplies from any postal station, could demand assistance from local officials, could travel anywhere in the empire without hindrance. This security and infrastructure enabled trade on a scale never before seen. Silk, porcelain, tea, and spices flowed west from China. Gold, silver, horses, furs, and timber flowed east from Russia and Central Asia. Persian carpets, Islamic manuscripts, glassware, and metalwork moved in all directions. Italian merchants established trading posts in Mongol-controlled cities. Chinese goods reached European markets in quantities that had been impossible before. The demand for Eastern luxuries in Europe would eventually drive the age of exploration, as Europeans sought sea routes to bypass intermediaries and obtain spices and silk directly. But trade was not just material goods. Ideas, technologies, religions, and cultural practices traveled the Silk Road alongside commodities. Mathematical concepts from India and the Islamic world reached China. Chinese inventions like gunpowder, the compass, and printing technology spread westward. Artistic styles influenced each other. Persian miniature painting techniques were adapted by Chinese artists. Chinese landscape painting influenced Persian and later European art. Medical knowledge was exchanged. Chinese acupuncture and herbal medicine were studied by Persian physicians. Islamic surgical techniques and pharmacology reached China. Religious exchanges were particularly significant. Nestorian Christianity, already present in Central Asia, spread further under Mongol protection. Buddhism traveled along the Silk Road, with Tibetan Buddhism gaining particular influence at the Mongol courts. Islam continued to spread eastward, converting populations in Central Asia and eventually reaching China, where Muslim communities established themselves in major cities. These religions coexisted under Mongol rule with a tolerance that was remarkable for the era. The movement of people was as important as the movement of goods and ideas. Artisans, scholars, engineers, and administrators traveled across the empire, seeking opportunities and patronage. A Chinese engineer might find himself building siege engines for a Mongol army in Persia. A Persian astronomer might be invited to establish an observatory in Beijing. An Italian merchant might spend years trading in Mongol cities, learning languages, studying customs, gathering knowledge that he would bring home. This cosmopolitanism created vibrant, multicultural cities at key points along the trade routes. Samarkand, despite its destruction during the initial Mongol conquest, was rebuilt and became a thriving center of commerce and culture. Karakoram, the Mongol capital, was a truly international city where you could hear dozens of languages spoken, where Buddhist monks debated with Muslim scholars, where Christian churches stood near Taoist temples, where merchants from Venice traded with merchants from Beijing. The Pax Mongolica also facilitated the transmission of agricultural knowledge and crops. New varieties of rice, wheat, and other grains were introduced to different regions. Irrigation techniques were shared. Persian water wheel technology was adapted in China. Chinese agricultural practices influenced Central Asian farming. This exchange increased productivity and helped feed growing populations. But perhaps the most profound effect of the Pax Mongolica was psychological and cultural. For the first time in history, people from vastly different civilizations interacted regularly and intensively. Europeans learned that China was not a mythical land but a real civilization with sophisticated technology and culture. Chinese learned about the Islamic world and Europe. Central Asians became intermediaries and interpreters between civilizations. This interaction broke down old assumptions and prejudices, or at least complicated them. It created a curiosity about the wider world, a desire to know what lay beyond the horizon. Marco Polo's account, dictated in a Genoese Prison in the 1290s, became one of the most widely read books in medieval Europe, not just because it described exotic places, but because it represented a new possibility. The world was larger and more diverse than Europeans had imagined. Other civilizations were not inferior or barbaric, but different, sometimes more advanced in certain areas. This knowledge would eventually contribute to the European Renaissance, to the questioning of old authorities, to the exploration of new ideas and new lands. Technologies and ideas flowed across the empire in both directions. Gunpowder, invented in China, reached the Middle East and Europe, where it transformed warfare and eventually led to the development of firearms and cannons. The compass, likewise from China, revolutionized navigation, enabling the age of exploration. Printing technology spread westward, though it would take centuries for Europeans to adopt it fully. Islamic astronomy and mathematics influenced Chinese scholars. Persian miniature painting techniques influenced Chinese art. Chinese porcelain and silk reached European markets in quantities that created demand and eventually inspired European attempts to replicate them. The Mongol Empire was the first true world system, connecting civilizations that had previously interacted only indirectly or not at all. It created networks of exchange that persisted even after the empire collapsed, laying the groundwork for the global trade networks that would emerge in the following centuries. But that system came at a horrific cost. The Mongol conquests killed millions of people. Exact numbers are impossible to determine, and estimates vary widely, but scholarly consensus suggests between 30 and 57 million deaths, perhaps 11 to 17% of the global population. Some deaths were from direct violence, from massacres and executions. Many more were from starvation, disease, and displacement. The Mongols destroyed irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture for centuries, complex networks of canals and aqueducts that represented generations of engineering and maintenance. In Persia and Mesopotamia, these systems were marvels of ancient technology, some dating back thousands of years. The Khanats of Persia, underground channels that brought water from mountain sources to arid plains, were particularly sophisticated. When Mongol armies swept through, they often destroyed these systems deliberately, flooding fields, breaking canal walls, ensuring that conquered regions could not quickly recover and resist again. They burned crops systematically, not just to deny food to enemy armies, but to terrorize populations into submission. Standing grain was torched. Orchards that had taken decades to mature were cut down. Vineyards were uprooted. The destruction was sometimes strategic, aimed at breaking the economic base of resistance. But it was also punitive, a message to other cities and regions. Surrender immediately or face not just defeat, but devastation so complete that recovery would take generations. Livestock was slaughtered or driven off in enormous numbers: cattle, sheep, goats, animals that represented the wealth and food security of agricultural communities were taken as plunder or killed and left to rot. In some regions, the Mongols converted agricultural land to pasture for their horses, displacing farming communities and fundamentally altering the landscape. This was particularly true in areas near the steppe, where the boundary between nomadic and settled life shifted dramatically in favor of the nomads. Entire regions were depopulated through a combination of massacre, enslavement, flight, and the collapse of food production. Refugees fled conquered territories, abandoning their homes and fields, swelling the populations of cities that would later themselves fall to the Mongols. Disease followed disruption. When agricultural systems collapsed, when populations were concentrated in besieged cities, when sanitation broke down and food supplies failed, epidemics erupted. Typhus, dysentery, plague, all flourished in the chaos of conquest. Some areas took centuries to recover demographically and economically. Persia's population, which may have been as high as 10 million before the Mongol invasions, plummeted to perhaps 2.5 million. It did not return to pre-Mongol levels until the 20th century, over 700 years later. The loss was not just in numbers, but in knowledge and culture. Entire communities of artisans, scholars and farmers were wiped out, taking their skills and expertise with them. Iraq's agricultural productivity was particularly devastated. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, had been one of the most productive agricultural regions on Earth for millennia. Its irrigation systems, continuously maintained and improved since ancient Sumerian times, supported dense populations and generated enormous wealth. The Mongol conquest shattered this system. Canals were broken, sluice gates were destroyed. The complex network of dikes and channels that controlled flooding and distributed water fell into disrepair. Without constant maintenance, the system degraded rapidly. Fields that had been green for thousands of years turned to salt flats and desert. Iraq's agricultural productivity never fully recovered. Even today, the region's agriculture is a shadow of what it was before the Mongol invasion. The environmental impact extended beyond agriculture. Forests were cleared for timber, to build siege engines, and to deny cover to defenders. Game populations were depleted by Mongol hunting expeditions and by the disruption of ecosystems. Rivers changed course when dikes and levees were destroyed, altering landscapes permanently. Some scholars have even argued that the Mongol conquests contributed to climate change, though this remains controversial. The depopulation of large areas allowed forests to regrow where farmland had been, potentially absorbing carbon dioxide and contributing to the cooling trend that became the Little Ice Age. But the destruction was not uniform or indiscriminate. Cities that surrendered immediately were often spared. Their populations were allowed to continue their lives under new management, paying taxes to Mongol overlords instead of their former rulers. The economic structures were preserved because the Mongols wanted to extract wealth from them. Artisans and skilled workers were particularly valued and protected. After a conquest, Mongol commanders would identify craftsmen, engineers, scribes, physicians, and other professionals, and spare them while less useful populations were enslaved or killed. This selective preservation created a strange paradox. The Mongol Empire was built on unprecedented violence and destruction, yet it also preserved and spread knowledge and technology. Chinese engineers who were captured and forced to serve the Mongol army brought Chinese military technology westward. Islamic scholars who entered Mongol service brought mathematical and astronomical knowledge eastward. Artisans who were relocated from conquered cities to Mongol capitals brought their skills to new markets. The long-term economic effects were complex. In the short term, conquest was catastrophic for the regions affected, but in the longer term, the integration of Eurasia into a single economic system created opportunities for growth and development. Cities that became nodes in the Mongol trade network prospered. New trade routes opened, markets expanded, the flow of goods and ideas accelerated. This was cold comfort to the millions who had died or who lived in ruined landscapes, but it shaped the world that emerged after the Mongol Empire fell. The psychological trauma was perhaps as significant as the material destruction. Entire generations grew up in the shadow of Mongol conquest, knowing that resistance meant annihilation, that survival required submission. This trauma shaped cultures and societies for centuries. In the Islamic world, the destruction of Baghdad and the end of the Abbasid Caliphate was a wound that never fully healed. In Russia, the memory of Mongol rule, the Tatar yoke, as it was called, influenced Russian identity and politics for centuries. In China, the Yuan dynasty was remembered with ambivalence. Foreign conquerors who had nevertheless unified China and brought a period of relative peace and prosperity. And the Mongol system itself was fragile. It depended on constant expansion, on conquering new territories and extracting their wealth. The Mongol economy was fundamentally extractive, tribute flowed from conquered peoples to the Mongol elite, funding their armies, supporting their lavish courts, maintaining the infrastructure of empire. When expansion stopped, when there were no more territories to conquer, the flow of wealth slowed. Internal pressures increased. The Khanates began competing for resources. The Golden Horde fought the Ilkhanate over control of the Caucasus, over trade routes and tributary territories. The Chagatai Khanate fragmented into rival factions, eastern and western, each claiming legitimacy. The Yuan dynasty faced rebellion from Chinese populations resentful of foreign rule, of being governed by people they considered barbarians, of being relegated to lower status in their own country. Kublai Khan died in 1294. He was 79 years old, obese and sickly, his body broken by age and excess. His later years were marked by grief and melancholy. His favorite wife, Chabi, had died. His chosen heir, his son Genghis, had died before him. He had outlived the people he loved most. He withdrew into excessive eating and drinking, into melancholy contemplation, mourning losses that wealth and power could not restore. After his death, the Yuan dynasty continued under a series of weaker rulers who lacked his ability and vision. They faced mounting problems that they could not solve. Inflation eroded the currency. Kublai had experimented with paper money, printing it to fund his wars and projects, but his successors printed too much, destroying its value. Corruption spread through the bureaucracy as officials exploited their positions for personal gain. Natural disasters, including floods and famines, ravaged the population. The Yellow River flooded repeatedly, killing hundreds of thousands, displacing millions. And rebellion became endemic. The most serious was the Red Turban Rebellion, which began in the 1350s. The rebels were a loose coalition of Chinese peasants, Buddhist millenarians who believed the end times were approaching, and local militias. They exploited Yuan weaknesses, seizing territory, establishing their own administrations. The Yuan government could not suppress them. The army was demoralized and corrupt. Commanders were incompetent. Soldiers were unpaid and mutinous. One of the rebel leaders was a former Buddhist monk and peasant named Zhu Yuanzhang. He had been born into poverty, had survived famine by begging, had joined a monastery to avoid starvation. When rebellion broke out, he joined the Red Turbans and rose quickly through talent and ruthlessness. He proved to be a brilliant military and political strategist, a man who understood how to build coalitions, how to inspire loyalty, how to defeat enemies and absorb their followers. By the 1360s, Zhu Yuanzhang had consolidated power in southern China, defeating rival rebel leaders through a combination of military skill, political acumen, and ruthless efficiency. He established an effective administration in the territories he controlled, recruiting capable officials, restoring agricultural production, rebuilding infrastructure. He presented himself as the champion of Chinese civilization against foreign oppressors, but he also learned from the Mongols, adopting their military organization and some of their administrative practices. His armies were disciplined and well supplied. In stark contrast to the corrupt and demoralized Yuan forces, he moved methodically northward, capturing cities, absorbing enemy troops, building momentum. The Yuan government, paralyzed by internal disputes and incompetent leadership, could not organize effective resistance. In 1368, his armies captured Khanbalik after a brief siege. The city fell without the massive destruction that had characterized earlier Mongol conquests. Zhu Yuanzhang wanted to preserve it, to use it as his capital. The Yuan emperor, Togon Temür, fled north to Mongolia with his court and remaining loyalists, retreating to the steppe from which his great-great-grandfather Kublai had emerged. Mongol rule of China ended after less than a century, barely 3 generations. It had been a brief interlude in China's long history, but it left lasting marks. Zhu Yuanzhang founded the Ming dynasty, proclaiming himself the Hongwu Emperor. His regime was explicitly nativist, defined in opposition to the Mongols. It emphasized Han Chinese culture, Confucian values, and the rejection of foreign influence. The Ming rebuilt the Great Wall, extending and strengthening it to keep nomadic invaders out. They promoted Chinese language and culture, suppressing Mongol and other foreign elements. They expelled or marginalized Mongols and other foreigners who had settled in China during the Yuan period. The message was clear: China was for the Chinese, and the Mongol interlude was an aberration to be erased. Yet, ironically, the Ming dynasty also inherited and preserved many Yuan innovations. The administrative structure, the tax system, the postal network, all bore Mongol influence. The Ming used paper currency, a Mongol innovation, though they eventually abandoned it due to inflation. They maintained trade relations along the Silk Road, benefiting from the networks the Mongols had established. They even adopted some Mongol military tactics and organization. The Mongols who fled to Mongolia did not give up their claim to China. The Yuan court in exile, known to historians as the Northern Yuan, continued to exist for decades, claiming to be the legitimate rulers of China. They raided Ming border regions, harassed Chinese settlements, tried to build alliances with other steppe tribes, but they never had the strength to reconquer China. The dream of Kublai Khan of a universal empire ruled from Beijing was over. The Mongols had returned to being a steppe power, important regionally, but no longer a world empire. The other Mongol Khanates lasted longer, but also declined. The Golden Horde, which ruled Russia and the Western Steppe, fragmented in the 15th century into smaller Khanates, each weaker than the whole. The Ilkhanate in Persia collapsed in the 1330s due to succession disputes, economic crisis, and the inability to maintain control over fractious territories. The Chagatai Khanate split into eastern and western portions, both of which weakened over time, prey to internal conflicts and external pressures. By 1500, the Mongol Empire was gone. Only in Mongolia itself did Mongol rulers persist, and even there they faced pressure from the rising Ming dynasty in China and later the Qing dynasty. The dream of a universal empire ruling the world under the eternal blue sky had ended. The Mongols had returned to the steppe, fragmented into tribes, their brief moment of world dominance reduced to memory and legend. One man tried to revive the empire in the late 14th century. Timur, also known as Tamerlane, was a Turco-Mongol conqueror who emerged from the chaos of the Chagatai Khanate's collapse. He claimed descent from Genghis Khan, though the claim was dubious, possibly invented to legitimize his rule. He could not claim the title of Khan, so he styled himself as Emir and married a descendant of Genghis Khan to strengthen his credentials. Timur conquered vast territories in Central Asia, Persia, and India. His campaigns were as brutal as those of his supposed ancestor. He sacked cities, massacred populations, built pyramids of skulls to terrorize his enemies. He destroyed what was left of the Ilkhanate, invaded India and sacked Delhi, defeated the Ottoman Empire at the Battle of Ankara. At his height, he controlled territories stretching from Turkey to India. But his empire, like the Mongol one, did not long survive his death. Timur died in 1405 while preparing to invade China, while planning to restore Mongol rule over the land Kublai Khan had lost. He died of illness in the winter cold, and his empire fragmented immediately. His descendants, the Timurids, ruled portions of his empire for decades, establishing brilliant courts that patronized art and science, but they never unified the empire or achieved the dominance Timur had briefly held. The Mongol legacy, however, endured in ways both obvious and subtle. The political map of Eurasia had been redrawn permanently. Russia, which had been a collection of small principalities before the Mongol invasion, emerged as a centralized state shaped profoundly by the experience of Mongol rule. The Grand Duchy of Moscow, which had collected tribute for the Golden Horde, eventually overthrew its Mongol overlords and claimed their mantle. The Russian Empire that followed in the 16th and 17th centuries was in many ways the successor to the Mongols, not the Russia's principalities. It adopted Mongol administrative techniques, taxation systems, and postal networks. Its expansion eastward across Siberia to the Pacific mirrored Mongol expansion. Its autocratic political culture, its emphasis on service to the state, its treatment of subject peoples all bore Mongol influence. In China, the Ming dynasty defined itself in opposition to the Mongols. It was a nativist regime that emphasized Han Chinese culture, that rebuilt the Great Wall to keep nomads out, that rejected foreign influence. But the administrative structures the Ming used, the examination system that selected officials, the centralized bureaucracy, all were influenced by UN practices, and the Qing dynasty, founded by the Manchus in the 17th century, explicitly modeled itself on the Yuan dynasty and claimed to be universal rulers in the Mongol tradition. The Islamic world was permanently altered. The destruction of Baghdad and the end of the Abbasid Caliphate decentralized Islamic politics.